Most people misunderstand this need. They see someone who chooses their own company and label them as reclusive, antisocial, perhaps even broken. But what they fail to recognize is that for certain souls, the inner world isn't an escape route. It's the foundation. It's where authenticity lives, where creativity breathes, and where the truest version of themselves waits patiently for their return. Perhaps it began in childhood. The playground always felt too loud, too chaotic, like a storm you couldn't predict. Birthday parties meant navigating social minefields. Group projects required you to wear a mask that never quite fit. You learned early that the world outside demanded a performance, an edited version of yourself that could pass inspection. So you cultivated something different, an interior landscape that didn't require you to audition for your own existence. There's a certain clarity that washes over you when you close the door behind you. Not the kind that comes from shutting people out, but the kind that comes from finally letting yourself in. It's that moment when the outside world, with all its demands and expectations, fades into background static, and you can finally hear your own thoughts without interruption. That's when solitude transformed from circumstance into sanctuary. It wasn't about hiding from the world. It was about honoring a different way of experiencing it. Research in environmental psychology shows that people with high sensory processing sensitivity experience their surroundings with greater intensity. For them, a crowded restaurant isn't just busy, it's overwhelming. Small talk isn't just boring, it's energetically draining. The hum of fluorescent lights, the texture of certain fabrics, the emotional undertones in casual conversations, all of it registers at a higher volume. This isn't weakness, it's a different kind of strength. These are the people who notice what others miss. They're the ones who can read a room's emotional temperature, who sense when something is unsaid, who understand that communication happens in the spaces between words. But this gift comes with a cost. The cost of needing to retreat, to recharge, to exist without the constant input of external stimulus. Let's talk about what really happens during solitude. When you're genuinely alone, not lonely, but alone, your mind shifts into a different gear. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, a state where your brain consolidates memories, processes experiences, and makes unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. This is where innovation happens, where insight emerges, where you finally understand something you've been carrying without comprehension. Think about your most profound realizations. They didn't arrive during a team meeting or at a networking event. They came during a long drive, in the shower, during that quiet hour before dawn when the world hasn't yet demanded anything from you. Solitude creates the conditions for these moments. It's not empty space, it's fertile ground. But here's where it gets interesting. Our culture treats solitude with suspicion. We've built an entire social infrastructure that celebrates constant connectivity. If you're not responding immediately, if you're not available on demand, if you need time to simply exist without documentation, something must be wrong. We've confused presence with proximity, mistaking the ability to be alone with the inability to connect. The truth is far more nuanced. People who embrace solitude often form deeper, more meaningful relationships than those who collect superficial connections. Why? Because they're selective. They understand that energy is finite, that attention is precious, that not every interaction deserves the same weight. When they choose to engage, they're fully present. When they choose to withdraw, they're not rejecting others, they're honoring themselves. There's a concept in psychology called introvert fatigue, but it extends beyond simple introversion. It describes what happens when you spend too long translating yourself for an audience that speaks a different language. You come home exhausted, not from physical activity, but from the emotional labor of managing impressions, moderating reactions, and maintaining a socially acceptable facade. Your space becomes a decompression chamber where you can finally drop that performance. And this is crucial. That dropping isn't weakness, it's honest. When the door closes and you're finally alone, the person who emerges is the most authentic version of you. No filters, no scripts, no strategic presentations. Just raw existence. Some people find that terrifying, others find it essential. Consider the relationship between solitude and creativity. History's most influential thinkers, artists, and innovators often credited their breakthroughs to periods of isolation. Not because they disliked humanity, but because creation requires space. It requires the freedom to explore ideas without immediate judgment, to follow strange tangents without explanation, to fail privately before succeeding publicly. When you're constantly surrounded by others, your creative impulses get edited in real time. You start thinking in acceptable parameters rather than authentic possibility. This extends to self-knowledge. How can you understand who you are if you're always performing for someone else? Identity isn't something you discover in crowds, it's something you excavate in stillness. Each moment of solitude is an archaeological dig into your own consciousness, revealing layers you didn't know existed. Your values, your desires, your boundaries. These things become clear when you have the space to hear yourself think. But let's acknowledge the shadow side. Not everyone who seeks solitude does so from a place of peace. Sometimes it's protective, sometimes it's a response to being hurt, misunderstood, or repeatedly disappointed by connection. Sometimes the inner world becomes a fortress rather than a sanctuary. The line between healthy solitude and self-imposed isolation can blur. This distinction matters. Healthy solitude energizes you. It feels like returning home after a journey. You emerge feeling more yourself, more capable, more ready to engage with the world on your terms. Unhealthy isolation depletes you. It feels like hiding, like you're shrinking rather than expanding, like the walls are closing in rather than opening up possibilities. The difference isn't always obvious from the outside, but you know it when you're honest with yourself. What psychology tells us is that comfort with solitude correlates strongly with psychological resilience. People who can be alone without feeling abandoned have developed what's called a secure internal attachment. They don't require constant external validation to know they matter. They've internalized a sense of worth that exists independent of others' opinions. This doesn't make them cold or disconnected. It makes them free. There's also something deeply countercultural about choosing stillness in an acceleration-obsessed society. We're surrounded by messages that equate busyness with importance, visibility with value, productivity with worth. Against this backdrop, the person who says, "I'm staying in tonight," is making a radical statement. They're suggesting that being is as valuable as doing, that presence doesn't require an audience, that a life can be meaningful even if no one is watching. This challenges fundamental assumptions. We've been taught that growth requires constant forward motion, that progress means never staying still. But what if stillness is its own form of movement? What if the deepest growth happens not in the pursuit of external achievements, but in the cultivation of internal awareness? What if the bravest thing you can do is stop running and finally face yourself? People who embrace solitude understand something profound. The relationship with yourself is the longest relationship you'll ever have. You can change partners, jobs, cities, friend groups, but you're stuck with yourself until the end. Shouldn't that relationship receive the same attention, care, and intentionality that you'd give to anyone else you deeply love? Solitude isn't selfishness, it's self-respect. Consider the physical space itself. For those who value solitude, their environment becomes an extension of their psychology. Every object holds intention. Books on the shelf represent conversations with ideas. Art on the walls reflects internal aesthetics. The arrangement of furniture creates pathways for thought and rest. It's not about interior design, it's about creating conditions where your mind can expand rather than contract. This is why the violation of personal space feels so devastating. It's not just about physical boundaries. When someone intrudes on your sanctuary uninvited, they're disrupting the ecosystem you've carefully cultivated for your own well-being. They're bringing the chaos you've worked hard to keep at bay. For people who need solitude to function, this isn't an inconvenience. It's a genuine threat to their equilibrium. But here's what often goes unsaid. People who love solitude aren't usually avoiding others. They're avoiding who they become around others. They're avoiding the performance, the mask, the exhausting translation work. They're not antisocial, they're selectively social. And there's wisdom in that selectivity. Quality over quantity isn't just a cliché when it comes to relationships. It's a survival strategy. The paradox is that by spending time alone, you often become better company. You process your emotions privately, rather than dumping them on others. You develop interests that make you more interesting. You learn to regulate your own energy, rather than depending on others to manage it for you. You show up to relationships more whole, more present, more capable of genuine connection, because you're not using others to fill voids they were never meant to fill. Let's talk about the guilt. Many people who prefer solitude carry a persistent undercurrent of shame. They wonder if something is wrong with them. They compare themselves to more socially active people and feel deficient. They apologize for needing time alone as if it's a character flaw. This guilt is cultural conditioning, not truth. There's nothing broken about requiring solitude. It's simply one way of being human among many. What if, instead of apologizing, you honored this need? What if you recognized that by taking care of your internal world, you're doing important work? The person who returns from solitude restored is contributing something valuable to the world. They're modeling that peace is possible, that you don't have to be constantly available to matter, that depth exists in stillness. There's also the creative dimension. When you spend significant time alone, your imagination becomes more active. You start noticing narrative in everyday moments. You find metaphors in ordinary objects. You develop an inner dialogue that's rich, complex, and deeply personal. This isn't self-absorption, it's self-cultivation. You're tending to the garden of your own consciousness, and what grows there eventually benefits everyone who encounters you. Think about what happens when you give yourself permission to truly rest. Not the rest of distraction, scrolling, binging, consuming, but the rest of presence. When you can sit in your own space without needing to fill it, without needing to justify it, without needing to turn it into content. When you can exist without agenda, that's when genuine restoration occurs. Your nervous system recalibrates, your perspective shifts. The things that seemed urgent reveal themselves as merely loud. This is the art of solitude, learning to be with yourself without judgment, without agenda, without the need to optimize or improve. It's radically different from our culture's approach to alone time, which often involves self-improvement projects or productivity hacks. True solitude asks for nothing. It simply offers space. And in that space, transformation happens. Not the transformation of becoming someone different, but the transformation of becoming more fully yourself. You remember interests that got buried under social expectations. You reconnect with values that got compromised for belonging. You rediscover parts of yourself that only emerge in silence. People who master solitude develop a kind of internal compass that external voices can't disrupt. They know what they think, not what they should think. They know what they feel, not what they're supposed to feel. They develop the rare capacity to distinguish between their authentic voice and the chorus of conditioning. This is freedom, and it's earned in quiet moments that no one else witnesses. So if you find yourself drawn to your own company, if you feel most alive in the spaces between social obligations, if your best moments happen when no one is watching, trust that. It's not avoidance, it's alignment. You're not running from the world, you're running toward yourself. And in a culture that constantly tries to pull you away from your center, that act of return is revolutionary. Because here's the final truth. The world needs people who know how to be alone. It needs people who've done the work of befriending themselves, who don't require constant external stimulation to feel alive, who can sit with discomfort without immediately distracting from it. These are the people who bring depth to shallow spaces, who offer perspective when everyone else is caught in reactive chaos. Your solitude isn't selfish, it's sacred. It's where you go to remember who you are beneath the roles you play, the expectations you carry, the identities you've accumulated. It's where the performance ends and presence begins. And if that makes you different, if that sets you apart, if that means you spend more time alone than others understand, that's not a problem to fix. It's a gift to honor. The art of solitude isn't about isolation. It's about integration. It's about creating enough internal space that when you do engage with the world, you bring your whole self rather than fragments. You show up complete rather than seeking completion. You offer presence rather than demanding validation. And that, ultimately, is what makes solitude so powerful. It doesn't diminish your capacity for connection, it deepens it. By learning to be at home with yourself, you stop asking others to be your home. You stop depleting relationships with unmet needs they were never designed to fulfill. You become a person who enhances others' lives rather than draining them. Not because you're better, but because you're whole. So close the door, turn off the notifications, give yourself permission to simply be. The world will still be there when you return. But you might finally recognize yourself. And that recognition, that homecoming to your own consciousness, is worth every moment of solitude you've ever needed.